This is Christopher Young, and this is Gotham and the Sacred. We live in a strange moment. By almost every measure, belief in God remains widespread. Churches still stand, sacred language still circulates. Moral claims are made constantly. And yet, something has collapsed. Not belief, but authority. Not faith, but function. This is Gotham and the Sacred. This is a podcast about philosophy, theology, ethics, and government, and about what happens when the sacred survives only as sentiment, but no longer orders our lives, restrains our power, or binds us one to another. This season, we explore a condition we call functional fatality, a world in which God is still spoken of, but no longer obeyed. God is invoked, but not feared, consumed, but not authoritative. We will ask uncomfortable questions. Can democracy survive without moral limits it did not create? Does capitalism depend on virtues it quietly erodes? Why do institutions fail when belief remains strong? And what replaces the sacred when it no longer binds? This is not a podcast about nostalgia or history. It is not a cultural war, and it is not easy answers. It is a serious conversation for a serious age. Welcome to Gotham and the Sacred. Empires rarely collapse in a single dramatic moment. They erode, they thin, they hollow out from within long before the final blow ever lands. They may look beautiful on the inside, but the inside is empty, dead and rotted. Historians often point to military defeat, economic decline, corruption, democratic shifts, or technological stagnation as the cause. Sure, all of these things matter, but they are rarely the deepest cause. Beneath armies and markets lies something less visible and far more powerful. A shared belief in something called the sacred. Something higher than rulers, higher than law, higher than public opinion, higher than the state itself. When that sacred foundation weakens, cohesion weakens. And when cohesion weakens, even the most powerful empire becomes fragile on the inside first. To understand this phenomenon, we begin with one of the most unsettling philosophers of modernity, Friedrich Nietzsche. When Nietzsche wrote the words, "God is dead," he was not celebrating, he was diagnosing. Nietzsche believed European civilization had slowly dismantled the metaphysical foundations of Christianity through Enlightenment rationalism, scientific materialism, and historical criticism. To Nietzsche, God was not violently overthrown. He became culturally unnecessary, or at least unnecessary in the imagination of modern elites. But Nietzsche understood something most of his age did not want to admit. Most did not want to admit that Christian morality, human dignity, equality before law, compassion, universal rights were not self-sustaining. It rested on Christian metaphysics. If human beings are created in the image of God, they possess inherent dignity. If moral law reflects divine law, it by definition has objective authority. If history unfolds under providence, sacrifice has meaning beyond the present moment. Removing God, Nietzsche argued, eventually will cause a moral structural collapse. However, he recognized that that moral collapse was not going to be immediate, but gradual. Moral language in our society still remains, but the grounding in that moral language has disappeared. Things that we historically defined as good and evil are no longer what they historically were. They are now what we call preference. And when morality becomes a preference, self-preference, power becomes ultimate. Nietzsche predicted something he called nihilism. Nihilism is not chaos in the streets at first, but rather a slow erosion of shared meaning. When nothing is sacred, according to Nietzsche, everything becomes negotiable. And when everything becomes negotiable, the power fills the vacuum. So for Nietzsche, religion in most historical civilizations was not merely private spirituality. Religion was infrastructure. Religion provided a ceiling over rulers. They answered to God. Religion, the sacred or God, provided a floor beneath citizens. They were protected by divine law. The sacred gave reason for sacrifice. Suffering could serve eternal purpose if you had the sacred. It placed limits on ambition. Rulers were not absolute. It justified obedience beyond fear. Loyalty was moral, not merely pragmatic. Without transcendence, without the sacred, political authority becomes self-referential. Without transcendence, it is restrained. History has shown us time and time again that without the sacred, without a grounding in a God, societies will indeed collapse. Consider the Roman Empire. Rome did not treat religion or the sacred as optional. The emperor held the title Pontifex Maximus, meaning chief priest of Rome. Political authority and sacred authority were fused together in the Roman Empire. Major decisions were preceded by augury, meaning interpreting of omens and divine guidance. To the Romans, the sacred mattered. Military victories in Rome ended in sacred offerings to Jupiter. The Vestal Virgins maintained an eternal flame believed to safeguard Rome's destiny. Religion was not separate from Rome. It was Rome. After Constantine the Great legalized Christianity, the sacred shifted, yet it did not disappear. Christianity became intertwined with imperial unity. Theological division threatened political stability. So orthodoxy was defended as a matter of state cohesion. But over time, belief fragmented, civic virtue weakened, corruption increased, and military loyalty became transactional rather than sacred. But Rome did not collapse in a single battle. It hollowed from the inside for long periods of time before it ultimately fell. When sacred identity no longer bound citizens together, external pressures become fatal. In last week's podcast, I talked about that extensively. To consider this idea further, consider the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman state became or was embedded by Islam. Islam was directly infused within its governance structure. The Sultan ruled as caliphate, successor to the Prophet in political authority. Sharia law, grounded in the rules of Islam, governed courts and social life. Political infrastructure, such as schools or hospitals, bridges, was funded through religious endowments known as the Waqf. 5 daily calls to prayer structured civic rhythm. The Sultan's name was proclaimed in Friday sermons across the empire, a weekly reaffirmation of shared political unity. For centuries, this sacred architecture sustained vast diversity across the many continents. But in the 18th and 19th centuries, secular reforms gained influence. Western administrative models were adopted. Religious authority within the Ottoman Empire weakened among the elites. The sacred canopy thinned. When this crisis struck, there was nationalist uprisings, economic instability, world war. The empire lacked the unity it once possessed. Erosion, or sacred erosion, preceded political collapse. Another example is the British Empire. The British Empire fused monarchy and Protestant Christianity. The monarch was crowned in Westminster Abbey and anointed in a sacred ceremony. The title, Defender of the Faith, was constitutional. The Church of England shaped law and public morality. Missionary movements accompanied imperial expansion. The abolition of the slave trade was championed by Christians such as William Wilberforce as a theological duty. However imperfectly applied, Britain saw itself as participating in divine providence. But by the 19th and 20th century, secularism spread. Church attendance declined, theological confidence weakened, the empire's moral narrative faded. Like Rome and like the Ottoman Empire, Britain did not collapse violently. It receded slowly. Sacred conviction no longer animated the necessary global sacrifice. This brings us to the United States. Sure, the United States was not founded as a theocracy, but it was undeniably grounded in transcendence and the sacred. The Declaration of the Independence appeals to nature's God, or the God's nature. Rights are described as endowed by their creator. Liberty rests on accountability to a higher law. For generations, public life reflected this. Congress opened in prayer. Presidents invoked divine judgment. National days of thanksgiving were declared. Movements like abolition and civil rights were driven by church leaders and biblical theology. The American experiment assumed that rights were rooted beyond government. But over the past 100 years or so, sacred cohesion in the United States has weakened. Church attendance has declined significantly since the mid-20th century. Religious affiliation has decreased over the past 20 years. Moral language increasingly rests on autonomy rather than transcendence. Institutions, although they remain strong, the shared sacred narrative amongst it is thinning. As we discussed last week, civic trust declines. Polarization increases. Rationalism expands. Founding religious identity becomes optional rather than foundational. The United States remains militarily powerful, economically dominant, technologically advanced. But history suggests power is not decisive, but cohesion is. And cohesion historically rests on transcendence. If rights are no longer grounded beyond the state, if morality becomes preference, if sacrifice loses sacred meaning, then Nietzsche's warning becomes relevant again. Empires do not collapse the day they lose belief. They collapse when belief no longer binds behavior. I'll say that again. Empires collapse when belief in the sacred no longer binds people's behaviors. So history does not claim that religion or the sacred guarantees permanence. It reveals a recurring structural pattern. No long-lasting empire has sustained cohesion without a sacred framework that restrains rulers, unifies citizens, and justifies sacrifice. Rome embedded the sacred in its imperial office. The Ottomans grounded governance in revelation. Britain fused monarchy with Protestant theology. America rooted its rights in the Creator. When sacred foundations thin, unity thins. Nietzsche asked whether civilizations could survive after killing God. We are still living inside that question. The future is not predetermined, but history offers us, all of us in the United States, a sober warning. Civilizations require something higher than themselves to endure. Without transcendence, without a sacred, power will indeed expand. And that power will be in the wrong hands. Without transcendence, without the sacred, morality will indeed fragment. Without transcendence and without the sacred, sacrifice loses meaning. And when sacrifice loses meaning, even the strongest, like the United States, will become fragile. We have noticed that this fragility was not immediate, but it's upon us. Fragility will ultimately and eventually come. And when you no longer have morality, what is there left? This is Gotham and the Sacred.